For this last set of podcasts, I want to go into some detail about proposals. You're obviously doing a proposal for this class, but for some reason, people don't really seem to conceptualize very well what proposals are until I actually have to do them commercially. I think it's a huge failure, and one of the reasons we're doing it in this class is to give you some insight and some practice into doing proposals before you're literally doing it, so that you can make rent. Proposals are a form of sales presentation. We're just going to assume that if you're, for example, in this project you've got with Macys, has sent this out. And so there's going to be a number of firms that are going to submit proposals. And for your purposes, regardless of whether you're doing it, competing with one company, 10 companies, or even if you're not competing, you always want to assume that you're being rated or scored, and you're being rated or scored compared to something or someone else. Proposals are the means by which you present to potential clients the expertise and the skills and the abilities that you offer to them to try to convince them that they should give you the money, give you the project, because you can best serve their needs. That's what a proposal is. Everything else is just gravy. But if you don't do those, then you don't deserve to ever get a proposal, and you probably never will, and your company will go under, or the company you work for will go under. Proposals have to be very carefully thought out, and they have to serve this very basic function. They're your presentation to the world. They're, sort of the summation of everything that you want to present in a way that you're not going to get on, LinkedIn or some other, job networking site. Those, for one thing, everyone's up on them. And secondly, is they're very non-specific. In this particular case, you've got Macys. It's a company, very large, very proud company. They've been around for a long time. They're really struggling now. The world has changed on them. There's been a sea change in the way that people purchase, and they're really struggling. And they're actually, in a very honest way, saying they need help. And what they don't need is someone who thinks they've got all the answers. What they do need is someone who can help them. And the other thing you have to remember with a proposal is you're asking someone for their money. You're asking someone to trust you. You're asking someone to basically pay you for your expertise. And they're assuming that your expertise is better than anyone else's is. That's why they hired you. It's amazing how often people tend to forget the client's paying the bills. That's one of the problems. I've been a consultant for a gazillion years. That's one of the huge problems you have is with folks that are consultants, is at some point they tend to forget that the hired gun, they think they're driving. They're not. The client's paying the bills. The client has a right, regardless of how silly the client's request might be. Hey, the client's writing the check. The client's debit card. So, they have the right to do whatever they want to. If you don't like it, then fine, you drop the project and you mutually agree to go in your own directions. But you don't sit there and do what you want to do versus what you told them they were going to get or what they thought they were going to get. And this is a huge problem. This is especially true in interior design consultants. There's a real attitude in the older members of the industry to sort of assume that they have the taste and the style, and that's sort of what the client's purchasing. That's not what the client's purchasing. The client is purchasing a set of expertise, given a very particular set of scenarios, vis-a-vis an apartment or a condo or a house or whatever. And they expect the designer to listen to them in terms of what it is they want, what it is they need, even if they're not sure what it is they want or need. You think part of the expertise of the designer is to elicit from them what they're not even particularly sure about themselves. That's why this class is so absolutely critical if you're going to be in commercial design, because a huge part of commercial design is figuring out the perceptions of your clients in terms of what they want, not your perception of the consultant. And this is something that people can be very, very, very bad at. And so this, you can just literally turn on the news, surf the web on any particular day and see a ton of examples of where folks paid no attention to what the clients were actually asking for and gave them what they thought they should, what they thought they needed. And then they wonder why the clients diss all over the parade and dump on them on Yelp or some other, rating site. And then you end up with this acrimonious, And at some point, it's a waste of time because guess what? Someone paid the money, and someone was basically taking that money. And the person that's taking that money does not have the driver's seat. That's sort of the end of the whole discussion. So let's take a look at a proposal. And it doesn't make any difference what the proposal is. This could be this project for this class. It could be a proposal because you're trying to get a contract with Office of Foreign Affairs. This could be a proposal for the state or federal or local governments. Proposals are the same. There's no difference, just because the client differs. And some proposals, for example, federal proposals tend to be more structured, but nonetheless, it's exactly the same. If it's a federal department, say Department of Defense, and they're asking for proposal submissions, there's a bunch of people competing, and you're going to be competing on the same levels of expertise. And I'm the best suited for this job as it would any other proposal. So proposals are always the same thing. There's very little difference in them. So let's walk through what the parts are. And this is sort of a standard. There's different ways to do this. This is one that we found successful in our company over the past. And I think it has the advantage that it's very straightforward. Clients, regardless of what they are, what particular area of discipline they're in, will recognize this form of a proposal. And I've never seen anyone say, well, reject it because they don't like the format. They might ask for more details. They might be surprised that there is so much detail, but nonetheless, this should work for you. So remember, first up, and you've got to constantly remind yourself of this when you start getting caught up in writing it, you've got to sell what you think your idea is. In other words, if in this case Macys says we need that, then you've got to come up with what you think is the answer to make that happen. And then you've got to, the form of the proposal is to argue why you're right. So if you think about it, this is exactly the same as your critical thinking papers. That's why I make you guys do those things. You treat this in exactly the same format. Here's the idea. Here's the evidence that supports why it's the best possible idea. And here's why we're the best suited to do it, which is also, of course, sort of implicit in the fact that you roll it up. So you're doing two things. You're selling the idea that this will help Macys out the best, and you're selling that you're selling your particular set of skills in your corporation, your entity, to achieve this goal. And of course, the hopeful result of this, when Macys reads that, they're going to go, "Wow!" And then you've got yourself a job. So if you're looking at this, it structures into basically 4 parts. The first part is an introduction. And this first thing is something you really, really, really have to do, because just as a note, many clients don't actually read a full proposal that you send in. What they do is they read the very first, paragraph or two, then they go back to the very end of it to see what the summary is, and then they look, if it's got a spreadsheet, they look to see what the cost is going to be. And only if they like all those do they actually bother to read the whole thing. And oftentimes the major decision makers won't. They'll have one of their staff read it and basically rate it. So it's almost like, American Idol or something like that sometimes. So you've got to be very careful in presenting things that remind the client that you know what you're talking about. And the first thing that you do is you actually quote the RFP. So let's take a little look back at what the proposal is. When you're looking at requests for proposals, which we call RFPs, in other words, the client sends out a request. I need this, I want this. Here's what the situation is. You have to look at these things very carefully. I've intentionally written this one from the standpoint of someone who sort of knows they're in trouble. So if you notice the way this is set up, the first 4 or 5 paragraphs are actually talking about how great Macys is and how they're what's usually called a flagship store, in a number of malls across the United States. And then when you get down here, you suddenly realize they're getting hammered. And from their corporate standpoint, from the standpoint of their shareholders, the CEO, and the rest of that, they're in huge trouble. And so they are trapped. They need to cut their cost. They need to do that by cutting their budget, by cutting their staff, by basically just liquidating whatever they can. But they're trapped because they have agreements. They have binding leases with the owners of the malls. And so they could either go to court and get it on the chin tip with another huge cost in terms of court fees, and then probably would have to pay a huge amount of money, which they don't have. Or in this case, they think rather cleverly, they've come up with an alternative. Because you have to remember that at some point, if you remember, go back and watch that mall video again. malls depend on foot traffic. If you don't have anyone in a mall, you're not selling anything. The more people you have in the mall, the more chance you have of selling them something. And so Macy's argument that they're presenting in this proposal is that Macy's will be allowed to close their retail operations if they can come up with some alternative way to use that space that will attract a large number of people to that space, and of course by extension to the rest of the mall. So in other words, the mall owners, even though Macy's isn't there, they will be making money because there's more people at the mall. Because if you know anything about malls right now in the United States, they are having a huge trouble with foot traffic. In this case, Macy's is part of the problem, but even if Macy's disappears tomorrow, that's not going to increase foot traffic. And in large part, there's no large retailers that want to take over these spaces, which is why so many malls are closing across the US. So in this situation, Macy's is looking for help. It's a real different type of proposal than I usually do, and that it's very much a behavioral thing, but it's also very much a design. You're trying to figure out in the 2020s, especially say up to 2030, 2040, how are you going to get people to go to a public space, a privatized public space that seems to be having trouble in terms of attracting people right now? So first off the bat, it has to be something different. So, just saying, well, you're going to replace it with a Walmart or something like that, I would point out it's not going to work. You have to assume that Macy's has smart people. And so all the obvious alternatives have already been examined, like finding someone else to buy them out for their leases, and that's not happening. And you also have to assume that to a certain extent, the partners, i.e. the owners of the malls, have also tried to replace Macy's because, at some point, if they can get some store that's really attractive in, they would be happy if Macy's would disappear because no one's going to Macy's. But they haven't been able to either. So basically everyone's just sitting around this big table with a big question mark on their head trying to figure out, what do we do with this enormous amount of space that's probably maybe 1/8 of the entire mall's square meters at that facility, and at Kahala Mall it's probably 1/6. And so that's what they're asking for help. And they're asking for potential options of the conversion of this space. So this is the actual RFP. So the request is for companies that have some ideas or an idea for converting these spaces into spaces that will draw in residents and visitors and increase the foot traffic. In other words, I tell you right here in this first sentence here what it is you're looking for. Now, in your introduction, in your proposal, you have to cite this. You should actually quote it. And this will immediately remind the client that right at the beginning, you're pay attention to what they're asking about, not coming up with some bright idea, about whatever. Because when a push comes to shove, they're paying the bill. So you want to make sure that you very clearly define what it is they're asking. Now you have to remember the other part of this. Remember, the other part is to sell your expertise. And so what you want to do right then, again, and you have to remember sort of in the back of your mind that there many of the actual decision makers, the guys that actually, pay the bills, aren't going to read the entire proposal. If you think about it, there's senior management at Macy's, they've got a whole mess of fires they're trying to put out right now. This is one potential solution. And of course, if you want to be real optimistic, you could think, well, if this potential situation would work here in Hawaii, then they might be willing to hire you to apply the same or some similar pattern to, stores in the mainland or somewhere else. So there's potential not only for a job, but if you do this right, there's potential for future work. And if nothing else, if you do this and you do it well, your company now has a label of a good batting average expertise in an area that, to be honest, most retailers in the United States would desperately want to see. And most mall owners would desperately want to have advantage too. So if you make this work, you're talking seriously big bucks. You immediately become players, at least at the national level, just by virtue of one project. And this is very typical. Expertise within an industry is oftentimes based on one really successful move that someone makes or one company makes. So, this has real potential. So the first thing you do is you actually go over and you repeat to them what it is they're asking for. You then have to go in and basically in a very short way, usually just a paragraph or two, sell what you think is the answer to that. Not in details, just a very short, you know, in our analysis, we think that will best achieve your goals. That's the intro. So the intro could be very short. The intro shouldn't be more than a page, maybe a page and a half at most, depending on how much of that quote you want to put in. So you don't get into details. The second part is actually useful because clients want to know that you're actually paying attention to them in particular, rather than just something generic. So you actually want to spend some time, and you'd be amazed how often companies don't do this when they submit proposals. You want to actually spend some time analyzing your client or your potential client. So in this particular situation, you have two things you want to look at. You want to look at Macys in the sense of their retail history and how they became so successful nationally and I guess globally. Secondly, is you also want to then analyze the locations, i.e. the malls that they're at, i.e. Ala Moana Center and Kahala Mall. Now, you don't have to go into a lot of detail, but you do want to talk about the time they've been around, the flagship stores, especially if you point out that, for example, Sears, I don't know if Sears was a Kahala Mall, but Sears was certainly the other flagship store at Ala Moana, and they closed. So you want to go through some of the dynamics of change in retail in the last 40, 50 years, not in a huge history, but at least to show that you know what the business is about, because these folks live in, they live and breathe that business. You don't. But you want to make clear to them that you understand enough of where they're coming from, that you can talk to them as someone who understands what they have to say. So again, remember that a lot of this has to do with sort of selling yourself and your competency and expertise. A big part of this one, more so than some other ones, would be you want to spend some time talking about the enormous sea changes in retail in the last 15 years. I wouldn't get too hung up on COVID because COVID is mainly an accelerant or an accelerator. The changes that were occurring in retail were happening anyways. COVID just accelerated them, completely out of normal proportion. So, for example, Amazon was growing, Target online was growing, but COVID just ramped that up tremendously. Basically, compressed probably 7 years of change into basically one, maybe 1.5. So you want to actually talk about that in some detail. And again, remember, you want to have sources here. You just don't want some flip off one sentence opinion. You want to actually have some detailed analysis. For this particular proposal, this might be a pretty substantial part of your entire proposal, because to a certain extent, arguing what it is you want to have as a solution is really dependent on your analyses of the current issue and situation. So you want to look at folks in the retail sector, folks who are, gurus of retail and what they've said has happened and what they see as the trends, and make sure, even if you don't agree with them, that you know what everyone's talking about or what everyone's saying, so that you can basically use them as a source. So again, remember the idea that you have to have sources to back yourself up. And especially in this situation, because your guys aren't supposed to be, particularly knowledgeable about retail. Your specialty is people and place, and how you manipulate and use places. So you're going to need to do some work to get this part done. But that's basically going to, in large part, I would argue, guarantee whether you're going to get this job or not. Okay, the third part is actually the real proposal. So this is actually where the rubber hits the road. One thing about it. So again, remember, in many cases, you're going to have to repeat stuff. You want to rephrase it a little bit, but so you want to go back. The first part of the actual proposal should be going back to what you talked about here, in terms of the actual project, current issues and trends, and you want to reiterate the ones that you think are critical. Now, this is where, if you don't agree with some of the industry, proposals, then this is where you would actually bring this out. So and so's who's really big in retail says that's going to happen. We don't agree because we see dun going on, and so this is the basis of our assumption. So this is going to get pretty intellectually sophisticated. And you want it to be sophisticated because the clients are going to be paying you big money. If this was actually Macys, I'm just guessing here, but if this was actually Macys and they were paying to have this proposal, they'd be probably talking about 200,000 to maybe $500,000. And I would suspect if they thought this was going to actually work, they would probably have a clause where they would be able to use you for other projects. So you very easily could be having a project here where you're looking at down the road $2 to $5 to $10 million, in projects and spin-off projects down the road, not to mention other companies or other malls. For example, if Ala Moana Center, if the owners decide that they want to use your expertise for other spaces that are empty, so you're literally talking millions here. So you want to make sure that you sound sophisticated. Don't worry if the client doesn't get it. Don't make it obtuse, but don't worry if your assumptions and your analyses are sophisticated. They should be. If they're too simple, then the client's going to think, well, hell, we could have thought of that. Why should we pay you the money? And they're going to do it in-house. So you got to remember, you've got to come across as having more expertise than the client does. Otherwise, why the hell would they hire you as a consultant? You have to go into some detail about what you actually see as the key issues of the design, in terms of your proposal. We think you should do X. What aspects, for example, of the layout of Ala Moana Center and where Macys is, or how Macys is there, and how people flow through Ala Moana Center, or could flow through Ala Moana Center, are central to your analyses. Same thing for Kahala Mall. So you have to think about how people use space, how people can use space, the potentials that you have here. And then third, you want to get into results. If you do as we say, and given these assumptions, we are comfortable that you will get these results. Okay? You don't have to get into huge details, but you have to make it clear how this is going to work and what it's going to work. So, you don't want to worry about telling Macys, well, you're going to be able to stay retail and sell stuff. What you want to tell is, if you do what we propose, you're going to get this type of, we are comfortable arguments, you're going to get this amount of foot traffic, and this amount of foot traffic will end up with, estimated X number of consumers in the mall, per day or something like that. You don't have to get real comfortable with the numbers, but just sort of vague things. And then that will end up, of course, answering the original question, which is we need bodies in there. For our purposes in this class, don't do the cost and time estimates. I mean, a real proposal you do. And if you have never done a proposal before, I would actually think about this a little bit, for your own, because you're going to be doing proposals. Everyone does proposals for a large part of their career. Start to figure out, little things like, for example, what's your time worth? What's your hourly rate? What should your hourly rate be? Many people underestimate it. They don't have to be always the same. Our company is a cooperative, and so people only get paid if they're actually working on that project. But we charge between $100 and $300 an hour for the time we spend, because we don't make a profit. In other words, the profit that people make is literally in their salary. So you'd also have to figure out what are your ancillary costs. Are you going to have to hire a historian, hire lawyers? Or are you going to have to hire someone who's a specialist in, for example, foot flow traffic in malls? You guys don't have to do that for this class. But do think about, if you're going to do this, the last thing you want to do is submit a proposal where the costs are so low when if you actually got it, you lose money. And trust me, we've done that. That's how you learn to make sure that you're charging enough. Having said that, you've got to be very careful if you're a for-profit company that you don't pad your bill so much that it looks like you're basically trying to vampire the client, because at that point they'll never hire you. Last part, the results. The results, again, this is for many clients or many, in a corporation, many of the folks actually reading the proposal will immediately jump to the last part. They just skip everything in between. And so you need to go back and actually reiterate from the request for proposal what it is Macys said they wanted. So again, you've got that 1 or 2 sentences. You want to reiterate those, maybe just rephrase it, but basically leave them almost intact. And then you immediately want to, in the next couple of sentences and probably a paragraph or two, go back and just repeat yourself in terms of what you're proposing and how it's going to achieve that. The last, which I strongly recommend, because very frequently companies don't do this, and I think it's a bad idea, and we've found in the past that clients really like this, is you want to actually have some sort of short discussion or analysis that if your proposal is accepted, if you get this job, you expect that, between 20 and 50 years from now, we call this trend forecasting or trend analysis, and something our company does a lot of. We expect that you're going to see these type of impacts from this. Just as an obvious one, just if you think off the top of your head, if you can come up with something attractive that fits current and near future behavior patterns in terms of how people use space, public space. However you get people to go to the mall, if you think that way. If that's going to work, then this has bigger impacts than just Macy's. And it also means that the mall owners, for example, Ala Moana Center, might be more comfortable in other entities at Ala Moana, say Neiman Marcus, which is in huge trouble also. If Neiman Marcus closes at Ala Moana, then that might not be the catastrophe they thought it would be if they had to replace it with another retailer when they have no other retailers. If your solution works, then maybe more and more the mall morphs into something that in a larger part of the mall represents or reflects the type of argument and structure that you've put in to replace the now absent retail force that was Macy's. And so you always want to have doesn't have to be, don't worry about this being cited, and don't worry about this, you don't want to look frivolous, but you don't have to worry about this being serious. But you do want to sort of give the idea to the client that when you're going to be used and your design is going to come into play to hire you, that this design doesn't just end when you get paid. So if the project takes 2 years in 2026 or whenever, it works, and then also by 2020, it's gone. You want to make it clear to the client that you've thought through the longer term implications of your proposal, and the benefit, of course, by extension of that, the benefit of accepting your proposal in contrast to your competition's. So remember, proposals are always competitive. Proposals are designed to reassure clients about the world around them. Remember that you're presenting your expertise, but you're also trying to reassure a client. The only reason that someone's going to ask for your expertise is because they feel like they don't have expertise in that particular area, whatever it might be. And one of the things that you find that we found is if you can consistently reassure a client that the money they spent on you was money well spent, you can very frequently find yourself ending up doing other types of work for the client in other areas where they've decided your expertise will also apply, even if you haven't. Our expertise is actually in environmental impacts. But over the years, the clients that we've worked with consistently asked us to do more and more in terms of trend forecasting analysis, because we always included that in the proposals. And they were impressed with not only the fact that we did that, but also how accurate we were. We're actually really good at that. And so they actually started asking for proposals that were an entirely different topic than the original environmental assessment stuff that we did. So you want to remember that, your expertise will grow, your clients' needs will change, but there's no reason you have to change clients. If they become comfortable with you and are very impressed with your professionalism, you might find that you have a fairly small persistent client base. And of course, especially here in Hawaii, but also in Asia, if you've got a client base that's happy with you, they're pretty good at talking that up, and you're going to find other folks that are interested in getting involved just because you've got a good reputation. And reputation is everything in the consultancy business.